I first started thinking about this maybe 15 years ago when I was reading Gebser. For the first time that I was aware of it, he wrote about these epochal changes in consciousness. So it wasn't like a developmental, across time, slow evolution. And it also wasn't directional, like maybe Aurobindo or something, the spirit is growing towards some final end. But it was much more of surprises that you could read in the archaeological record. So he'd look at art and archaeology and prehistory and then going into history and notice how there seemed to be something fundamental underneath the structure of consciousness that changed quite dramatically in different epochs. And of course, there's continuity, but if we look at the middle periods of each epoch, we can see that there's quite a lot of discontinuity. So this notion of epochal change is very similar to speciation. We know that, for example, the apes became humans, but in the murky middle, it's not clear when these happened, but there are other instances in science. We look into the past, and on the one hand, we know there's continuity, but there's also always this notion of these discrete periods of discrete change. And he was talking about that in terms of consciousness. And what was interesting to me at the time was not so much in the history, but to say, wow, that might be happening now. Like, where would we go to see what these new forms of consciousness might look like? Because he said, before the old form of consciousness is obsoleted, and before the new form of consciousness takes hold and becomes healthy, let's say, there's this period of latency. And he would show in his book, The Ever-Present Origin, how, for example, some lyrical poetry had some structures of the past, but was becoming more like the modern mind. And you could start to study change, not from this like pattern that you see here, which we might call a developmental pattern, but from these structures that, almost change overnight. That's just a metaphor. And so he laid out some of that, but what I was particularly interested in is what was also being called the axial age mind. So right around the time, about 3,000 years ago, Buddha and Socrates are always put in the same axial age. We can see that the new type of mind, which is the kind of mind we have today, was emerging. What was very interesting to me about this was that certain words were being used to describe this type of mind by the people who were undergoing it themselves. So Buddha had certain ideas of how this mind worked, and Plato called this mind diaresis, which means to separate. So instead of just having this story where people were acting courageously or virtuously, he said, well, let's separate out these qualities. What is virtue? What is courage? And let's look at them directly. So this was a new type of mind. And what was interesting is diaresis does mean to separate. And so this is the kind of mind we have. It's based on fragmentation. So that was interesting to me. What was also interesting to me is that this is the time where you see people become aware that they're thinking with thoughts. So you have Socrates claiming that a divine being is speaking to him, but also the way they're examining their words and getting to know themselves, some kind of analytic reduction of their own thoughts. This was very exciting because you would assume, if you didn't know this, that once humans were humans, we could think thoughts in our heads. Because it's so prevalent in our life. But there was actually a time when this faculty emerged. So these kind of signifiers that Gebser was laying out were really fascinating to me, because it also suggested that there was a time before we had a dialectical mind, and there may be a time when we no longer have a dialectical mind. You don't actually lose them, but you gain different capacities. And I was really fascinated with what would that mind be like? And I started hypothesizing certain characters that seemed to be latent, that may be showing directions in towards that new mind. And we also had some pretty good landmarks from Gebser, like it wouldn't be diaresis, it wouldn't be separation. And the interesting thing about separation is that once you organize the world into like two things, and they're in tension together, like thesis and antithesis, then to put them together, you have to get more complex. So that's the dialectical synthesis. And Plotinus called this kind of reasoning the language of the gods, and he called it the upward path. So everything gets more and more complex, transcend and include, Wilbur would say. But it's because the first move is this diaresis. And so then this made me think, well, one of the categories of the new mind is it would no longer get trapped into this increasing complexity. So we're dealing with hyperobjects and stuff like that. But it could make a different move. And very early on, I thought this move would be, if you see a thesis and antithesis, you ask, what is the deeper unity it comes from? You see, it's a completely different move. It's not what is the higher synthetic, more complex, more complexity, transcendence. But the way Gebser was describing it, and even Plato, he was saying the mind is separating and then separating, isolating the separate parts and examining them out of context, basically. What if when you're faced with any kind of duality or dualistic situation, or you're faced with a problem, like should I do this or that, anything that comes in these dualistics, what if instead I say, where are they coming from? What is the prior unity that they're bifurcating from? And can I work with that? So for me, epochal change had to do with this notion of large changes in consciousness. And some of the key factors I was looking for was the structure of reasoning that wouldn't go up in this way, but that would go down. And a lot of my work is like what's underneath, what's down there, what's prior. Everything you think you know, I would say maybe 70% of it, is been shaped by the modern imperative and is no longer true. Fundamental knowledge has been shaped by the exigencies and conditions of the modern imperative towards standardization, industrialization. And then slowly but surely we think that's how these things are. It reminds me of when they said they invented the 45 record, that all the songs became 1 minute and 20 seconds long, because the technology constrains the imagination to what is available. And this is what I think modern society has constrained what is available for us to know to the exigencies of modern reality, and that we actually don't know anything anymore. I always talk about this is the kind of mind we have today, not the nature of mind. This is the kind of psyche we have today, not the nature of psyche. These are the kinds of bodies we have today, the obesity, and anxiety, and gender dysphoria. These were not always the kinds of bodies we had. You could argue that's a mind. But so then the question is, if you want to purge the mind or change your relationship to your body in these radical ways, then it would be helpful to know what is the nature of the mind. And so it's kind of like saying, here's a glass of milk, here's a glass of water, here's a glass of orange juice. And then finally understanding what the glass is and realizing that now the glass can hold beer, right? And maybe that's an improvement, right? And you say, oh wow, I can hold beer in this, right? So so that's the question, to understand. It's not like, some of the classic Buddhists, where you're not trying to not think, you're not trying not to have psychic subtle phenomena, you're not trying to purge any of these faculties, because one could surmise that they have a native intelligence, and that we're not just some kind of cancerous blob in the history of the life's force. So how then do you go through the inquiry about the nature of mind? And this is actually quite easy, except people have malware, so it's hard for them to accept. But so the human mind is continuous with our animal nature. And so you want to first, you can understand that a lot of the properties of our mind directly match on to animal minds. This is to do with clay cells and nervous systems and perceptual systems and sensory motor core and the exact same types of glial cells. And we're talking about something that's scientifically inseparable at a certain level. And then, so then you know, okay, well that's rock bottom. Something about the nature of my mind is like an animal mind, because that's where it comes from. And so, like, animals can simulate their environment, work out a couple of steps of a problem before they don't have to go and trial and error. And so our minds are like that. They simulate our environments. They simulate a whole lot more than animals do. But you can say, oh, well, that's part of the nature of mind. So you can find the nature of mind and psyche by finding where it's continuous with your animal nature, and then noticing that it is also a glass, but it's holding different, the animals are holding milk and our glass is holding beer or something like that. And then you slowly start to ask, is that the only use of that muscle, that mind, or that psyche? And so the reason why this is really important is because a lot of how we go about assessing people psychologically, cognitively, and actually spiritually or ethically and morally is based upon the norms of the kinds of minds and kinds of psyches and kinds of bodies we are today. And so we create theories that this is the stages people go through. And so then what happens is we can't identify, we can't see that there's new latent ways, new latent minds, because they seem deviant, because they're not following this path. So to answer your question, the easiest way to enter into that inquiry is to look at our animal nature. Now, I said it's easy, but it's hard for most people because they don't believe that human minds are actually continuous with animal minds. They believe in something called emergence, and they call this overdoing of emergence as emergentism. And what they say is, yes, there's a continuity, but at a certain point, human mind emerges as a distinct apparatus or something. And for me, that's like saying the hand of God gets in there and does something. So it's, to me, indistinguishable from the divine fiat or something. And I think that much more counterfactual arguments should be made about questioning this notion of emergence. Why are we wedded to the notion of emergence? It's not scientifically forced on us. It's narratively adopted by us because we have certain, I think, allergies to imagining ourselves as continuous with the animal and natural world. Now, a lot of that is changing, like the work of Michael Levin is changing that dramatically. This is another thing to watch if you're living in this time between worlds. There are pockets of epochal change happening that combine speculative thinking with, experimental studies. So again, we started off with this move that's not diuretic. The nature of mind, let's find it up there in the ether through some kind of transcendental meditation, which with the upward path goes. It's like you have this divergence, animal and human. What is the deep universal they're divergent from? So you have animal mind, human mind. They diverge from the nature of mind itself.